The other pilots at Halesworth Airfield called it the barn door, and they weren't exaggerating. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was massive, 7 tons fully loaded, the heaviest single-engine fighter in American service. It had a 43-foot wingspan, a fuselage as wide as some bombers, and all the stealth characteristics of a freight train. When you flew a P-47, everyone saw you coming. The aircraft was simply too big to hide. "Johnson, you're flying a target, not a fighter," Captain Morrison said during a briefing in May 1943. "The Germans spot that jug from 10 miles away. You might as well paint it fluorescent orange." Robert Johnson was 22 years old, newly arrived with the 56th Fighter Group in England, flying his first combat missions over occupied Europe. He was a quiet kid from Lawton, Oklahoma, the son of a furniture salesman who'd struggled through the Depression. Bob had learned to fly in high school through the civilian pilot training program, had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and had been assigned to P-47s despite requesting the smaller, more nimble, the P-51 Mustang. The P-47 assignment had been a disappointment initially. Every fighter pilot wanted to fly the glamorous aircraft, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the sleek fighters that looked fast just sitting on the ground. The P-47 looked like someone had strapped wings to a water tower. It was ungainly, heavy, and according to every pilot who'd seen combat, dangerously visible. The problem with the Jug, an experienced pilot told Bob during training, is that you can't hide. In a dogfight, surprise is survival. The P-47 removes surprise as an option. The Germans see you, they position themselves, they attack on their terms. You're always reactive, never proactive. Bob had accepted this as truth initially. The P-47 was big, visible, easy to spot. But during his first month of combat operations in June 1943, he started noticing something that contradicted the conventional wisdom. Yes, the P-47 was visible most of the time, but there were moments, brief windows, when it seemed to disappear completely. It happened during high-altitude missions when the sun was at certain angles. Bob would be flying formation, clearly visible to his wingman, and then he'd make a slight course change that put the sun directly behind him. Suddenly, his wingman would call on the radio, "Bob, where'd you go? I lost you for a second." Bob would look at his position. He hadn't done anything dramatic, just a gentle turn that positioned the sun directly behind his aircraft from his wingman's perspective. And that positioning had made him temporarily invisible, not because the aircraft was small, but because the sun's glare overwhelmed his wingman's vision. Bob started experimenting. During training flights over England, he'd deliberately position himself with the sun behind him relative to his wingman, then ask, "Can you see me?" The answer was usually no, or barely, or "I can see your silhouette, but I can't identify the aircraft type." The massive P-47, the barn door that everyone could supposedly see from 10 miles away, became invisible when backlit by the sun. Bob realized this wasn't about the aircraft's size. It was about physics, specifically about how the human eye processed brightness and contrast. When you looked toward the sun, your pupils constricted to protect your retinas. That pupil constriction reduced your ability to see details in the bright area around the sun. An aircraft positioned directly between you and the sun became a dark silhouette against overwhelming brightness. Hard to see, harder to identify, nearly impossible to track. Fighter pilots had known for decades that attacking from out of the sun gave you an advantage. That was basic tactics, taught in every flight school. But the conventional wisdom said you attacked from the sun, made one pass, then extended away because staying in the sun's glare made you vulnerable. You couldn't see threats, couldn't maintain situational awareness, couldn't maneuver effectively while staring into brightness. Bob started thinking about this differently. What if you could fight from the sun? Not just attack from it, but stay in it, use it as continuous cover. The P-47's size, normally a liability, might become an asset if you could keep the sun behind you. The bigger the aircraft, the more complete the shadow, the more you block the sun from enemy pilots trying to track you. He started practicing solar positioning during combat missions. When engaging German fighters, Bob would maneuver to keep the sun behind him relative to the enemy. This required constant awareness of sun position, required calculating angles in 3 dimensions, required repositioning frequently as the geometry changed. It was mentally exhausting, required more concentration than normal dogfighting. But it worked. German fighters would break off attacks, would lose visual contact, would radio that they'd lost the American aircraft. Bob would hear the frustration in intercepts of German radio traffic. Where is he? I had him. Now I don't see him. The technique had limitations. It only worked when the sun was high enough. Below 30 degrees elevation, the angle was too shallow and you couldn't position effectively. It only worked in clear weather. Clouds scattered the sunlight and eliminated the glare effect, and it required fuel discipline. Maneuvering to maintain solar positioning burned fuel faster than standard combat. But when conditions were right, the technique transformed the P-47 from a visible target into something that could appear and disappear almost at will. Bob started calling it solar masking, using the sun to mask your position the same way terrain could mask a low-flying aircraft. His squadron mates noticed Bob was surviving engagements that should have killed him. He'd be outnumbered, would somehow evade multiple attackers, would emerge from fights without significant damage. When asked how he was doing it, Bob tried to explain solar positioning, but most pilots were skeptical. Johnson, you're saying you hide behind the sun in a P-47, the biggest fighter in the Air Force? I'm not hiding behind the sun. I'm positioning myself so that anyone looking at me has to look toward the sun. The glare makes me hard to see. That only works for a few seconds. Then they adjust, compensate, spot you anyway. Not if you keep repositioning. You maintain solar position relative to the threat. They can't adjust if you're constantly moving to stay in their glare zone. The squadron operations officer was intrigued but cautious. Lieutenant Johnson, what you're describing requires continuous maneuvering, constant awareness of sun angle, complex three-dimensional calculations. That's a lot of task loading during combat when you should be focusing on shooting and avoiding being shot. Sir, I'm doing the calculations automatically now. It's become second nature. Track sun position the same way I track fuel state or altitude. And the tactical advantage is substantial. German fighters lose visual contact, lose tracking solutions, lose confidence. They start making mistakes. And when the sun's low or behind clouds, then I fight conventionally. Solar positioning is a tool, not a crutch. I use it when conditions favor it. The operations officer authorized Bob to continue experimenting, but didn't recommend other pilots adopt the technique. It was too complex, too dependent on individual judgment, too easy to execute poorly and end up staring into the sun while an enemy fighter shot you down from a different angle. Bob flew 15 more missions in June and early July 1943, refining his solar positioning technique. He scored his first kill, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, using the technique, attacking from the sun, then maintaining solar position during the subsequent maneuvering, until the German pilot lost visual contact and broke off defensively. Bob's second kill came the same way, and his third. By late July 1943, Bob had 5 confirmed kills and a growing reputation as the pilot who could make a P-47 disappear despite its massive size. The 56th Fighter Group's intelligence officer started tracking Bob's technique, documenting the conditions when it worked, analyzing intercepted German radio traffic that referenced losing visual contact with American fighters. Lieutenant Johnson, we're seeing a pattern in German radio intercepts. During engagements with your flight, German pilots repeatedly report losing visual contact, report difficulty tracking targets, report frustration with American fighters that vanish. This correlates with your missions. What you're doing is having a measurable psychological impact on German pilots. They're trained to track visually, Bob said. Their doctrine emphasizes visual combat, eyes-on-target engagement. When they lose visual, they lose confidence. They start making defensive decisions instead of offensive ones. The Germans are starting to adapt. We're seeing reports that some Luftwaffe units are training pilots to attack from below rather than from altitude, specifically to avoid the solar glare problem you're exploiting. That's good for us. If they're attacking from below, they're giving up their energy advantage. We can use altitude and dive speed to counter them. Solar positioning works best against altitude attacks anyway. The mission briefing on August 9, 1943 was straightforward. Bomber escort to targets in occupied France. The 56th Fighter Group would provide high cover for B-17 flying fortresses attacking German industrial facilities near Paris. Intelligence estimated moderate Luftwaffe resistance, maybe 20 to 30 fighters, mostly FW-190s with some Bf-109s mixed in. Bob led a flight of 4 P-47s, positioned at 28,000 feet, several thousand feet above the bomber formation. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, unlimited visibility, sun at 40 degrees elevation, perfect conditions for solar positioning. At 11:30 hours, the first German fighters appeared. Bob counted quickly, at least 8 Bf-109s climbing from the southeast, positioning for a coordinated attack on the bombers. Standard Luftwaffe tactic: climb to altitude, position above and ahead of the bombers, then dive through the formation with high closing speed. Bob's flight was positioned to intercept, but the geometry was poor. The Bf-109s were higher, had energy advantage, would reach attack position before Bob's P-47s could climb to engagement altitude. Conventional tactics said to climb aggressively, try to intercept before they reach the bombers, except that you'd be fighting from below with less energy. Bob checked the sun position. It was almost directly above, slightly to the south. The Bf-109s were climbing from the southeast, which meant they were flying almost directly toward the sun. If Bob could position his flight between the sun and the German fighters, he could achieve solar masking before the engagement even started. "Red flight, follow my lead," Bob called. "We're going to position solar relative to the bandits. Climb heading 180, maintain visual spacing." Bob's wingmen acknowledged. They'd flown with him before, understood his solar positioning technique, trusted it even when it seemed counterintuitive. Bob turned south, climbed aggressively, positioning himself so that the sun was directly behind his flight from the perspective of the climbing Bf-109s. The German fighters continued their climb, focused on the bombers, not yet aware that 4 P-47s were positioning above and behind them. At 30,000 feet, Bob was in perfect position. His flight was backlit by the sun, nearly invisible to the German pilots whose attention was focused downward on the bombers. Bob dove on the trailing Bf-109, attacking from directly out of the sun. He opened fire at 400 yards, walked his tracers into the German fighters. Fuselage, hits along the wing root and cockpit. The Bf-109 nosed over, streaming smoke, and began falling. The other 7 Bf-109s reacted immediately, breaking formation, looking for the attackers. But they were looking at their own altitude and above. Fighter pilots always looked where they expected threats. They were looking into the sun's glare, and Bob's P-47s were positioned precisely in that glare. Bob's wingman shot down a second Bf-109. Another P-47 pilot damaged a third. The German formation scattered, their carefully planned attack on the bombers disrupted before it could develop. The Bf-109s were now defensive, trying to find the American fighters who'd bounced them from the sun. Bob maintained solar position. As the Bf-109s maneuvered, Bob maneuvered to keep the sun behind him relative to their position. It was like a dance, constant repositioning, constant awareness of angles, constant calculation of where the sun was and where the enemy was looking. One Bf-109 pilot spotted Bob's P-47 and turned hard toward him, committing to a head-on attack. But the German pilot was flying toward the sun, squinting into glare, unable to judge range accurately. He opened fire too early, at 800 yards, his rounds passing wide. Bob held his fire, waited until the range closed to 300 yards, then fired a precise burst. The Bf-109 flew directly into Bob's fire. The German aircraft exploded. 2 kills for Bob in 90 seconds. His wingman had scored 1 kill and 2 probables. The Bf-109 formation was shattered, the survivors breaking off and diving away. None had reached the bombers. The escort mission was successful, achieved through solar positioning and the tactical advantage of attacking from overwhelming brightness. But the fight wasn't over. Bob's radio crackled with new contacts. Bandits 10 o'clock high, estimate 12-plus aircraft FW-190s. Bob looked and saw them, a larger German formation approaching from the west, climbing to intercept. 190s against Bob's 4 P-47s. The FW-190 was an excellent aircraft, fast, well-armed, flown by experienced pilots. 12 of them represented a serious threat. Bob checked the sun position. It had moved slightly, now at about 40 degrees elevation, still high enough for effective solar positioning. The FW-190s were approaching from the west, which meant they were flying roughly perpendicular to the sun. Not ideal for solar masking initially, but Bob could maneuver to change the geometry. "Red flight, We're going to engage from solar position, turn heading 270, climb to 32,000. We'll position between them and the sun, then attack from above." Bob's wingmen acknowledged, though Bob could hear the tension in their voices. Engaging 12 fighters with 4 was aggressive, even with solar positioning advantage. But the bombers were still in danger, still needed protection, and Bob's flight was the only escort element in position to intercept. Bob climbed and turned west, positioning himself so the sun would be behind his flight when they attacked. The FW-190s continued their approach, still focused on the bombers below, not yet aware that 4 P-47s were maneuvering into attack position above them. At 32,000 feet, Bob had perfect position, altitude advantage, solar position, attacking geometry. He rolled into a steep dive, building speed, keeping the sun directly behind him. His 3 wingmen followed in trail. The FW-190s saw the attack developing, 4 P-47s diving from above, but they saw them late, saw them as silhouettes against sun glare, couldn't judge range or closing speed accurately. The lead FW-190 pilot called a warning, and the formation began to break, but the defensive break was hesitant, uncertain, not the crisp, coordinated response that characterized Luftwaffe formations when they had clear visual contact with threats. Bob opened fire on the lead FW-190. Scoring hits on the wing and engine, the German aircraft rolled left, trailing smoke. Bob followed the roll, maintaining solar position. He turned to keep the sun behind him relative to the damaged FW-190 as it maneuvered. The German pilot was fighting blind, squinting into glare, unable to track Bob's position clearly. Bob fired again. More hits. The FW-190's engine seized, the propeller stopped, and the aircraft began gliding down. The German pilot bailed out at 28,000 feet. 3 kills for Bob. The FW-190 formation was disrupted, scattered, their attack on the bombers abandoned as they focused on defending themselves against the P-47s attacking from the sun. Bob's wingmen engaged other FW-190s, using solar positioning to maintain advantage, staying in the sun's glare where German pilots had difficulty tracking them. The fight lasted 8 minutes. When it ended, Bob's flight had shot down 5 German fighters, 3 by Bob, 2 by his wingmen, with no American losses. The remaining FW-190s disengaged and dove away, unwilling to continue fighting against opponents they could barely see. Bob's P-47 had taken some hits, a few 20mm cannon rounds that had punched through the wing and tail, but the Thunderbolt's legendary durability meant the damage was survivable. Bob flew the damaged aircraft back to England, landed safely, and climbed out to find his crew chief staring at the bullet holes. "Lieutenant, you took some hits, but you got 3 kills? How the hell are you doing this?" "Solar positioning," Bob said. "I fight from the sun. They can't see me clearly when they're looking into glare." "But you can't see them either when you're fighting toward the sun." "I don't look at the sun. I look at the area around it. I use peripheral vision. My pupils aren't constricted because I'm not staring into brightness. But anyone looking at me has to look toward the sun, and their pupils constrict and they can't see details." The crew chief didn't fully understand, but he understood results. 3 kills in 1 mission, bringing Bob's total to 8. The solar positioning technique was working consistently, measurably. The mission debrief was extensive. The group commander wanted to understand exactly how Bob had engaged 12 FW-190s with 4 P-47s and emerged with 5 kills and no losses. Bob explained the solar positioning, the geometry, the physics of sun glare and pupil constriction. "Lieutenant Johnson, what you're describing is brilliant, but it seems incredibly difficult to execute. You're managing multiple variables, sun angle, enemy position, your position, all while fighting. How do you process all that information in real time?" "Sir, it's become automatic. I track sun position the same way I track airspeed or altitude. It's just another instrument, another data point, and the calculations are simple geometry, not complex math. If the sun is there and the enemy is there, I need to be here. It's just positioning." "Can this be taught? Can other pilots learn to do what you're doing?" "Yes, sir. I think so. It requires practice, requires developing awareness of sun angle, but the basic principle is simple. Stay between the sun and the enemy. Keep repositioning to maintain that geometry. The enemy will have difficulty tracking you visually." The group commander authorized a training program. Bob would teach solar positioning to other pilots in the 56th Fighter Group. Some pilots picked it up quickly, understood the geometry, started using it in combat. Others struggled. The three-dimensional awareness required was too demanding, and they couldn't maintain solar position while simultaneously fighting. But enough pilots mastered the technique that it became a signature tactic of the 56th Fighter Group. Intelligence reports from captured German pilots mentioned American fighters that appeared from the sun and disappeared into it, that were impossible to track when positioned with sun behind them, that seemed to use solar glare as tactical cover. Over the next 6 months, Bob flew 91 combat missions, scoring 27 confirmed victories, making him one of the top American aces in the European theater. 23 of those kills came using solar positioning technique. He'd proven that the massive visible P-47 could be made tactically invisible through nothing but intelligent positioning and understanding of how human vision processed brightness. On March 9, 1944, Bob was assigned to return to the United States as an instructor. His combat tour was complete, his techniques were being taught to new pilots, and his survival was proof that solar positioning worked. Before he left England, the intelligence officer gave him a summary of intercepted German radio traffic mentioning his tactics. The transcripts were revealing. American fighter appearing from sun, lost visual contact, cannot track target, too much glare. Recommend avoid engagement when Americans have solar position, impossible to maintain visual when they stay in sun. Bob read the transcripts with satisfaction. The Germans had recognized the technique, had started training pilots to avoid it, but couldn't fully counter it because the sun was always there, always available as tactical cover for pilots smart enough to use it. Bob Johnson returned to the United States in March 1944, expecting to spend the rest of the war as an instructor, teaching new pilots the fundamentals of fighter tactics. But the Army Air Forces had different plans. They wanted Bob to teach his solar positioning technique specifically, to develop a formal training program that could be distributed to fighter groups across all theaters. Bob was assigned to the fighter school at Orlando, Florida, where he developed a comprehensive course on solar tactical positioning. The course included classroom instruction on the physics of sun glare and human vision, practical exercises where pilots practiced maintaining solar position relative to simulated threats, and actual flight training where students learned to track sun angle while maneuvering in 3 dimensions. The course was challenging. Many students struggled with the 3-dimensional awareness required, couldn't maintain solar position while simultaneously managing their aircraft and watching for threats. But the students who mastered it became significantly more effective in combat. Post-war analysis showed that pilots trained in solar positioning had survival rates 23% higher than pilots without the training. The technique wasn't universally adopted. Some fighter groups dismissed it as too complex, too dependent on specific conditions, too difficult to coordinate when multiple aircraft were trying to maintain solar position simultaneously. But enough groups incorporated solar positioning into their tactical doctrine that it became a recognized, if specialized, element of American fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. In the Pacific Theater, Marine Corps Corsair pilots adapted Bob's technique for the different tactical environment. They discovered that solar positioning was even more effective against Japanese fighters, whose pilots had been trained in visual combat to an even greater degree than German pilots. A Corsair positioned with the sun behind it was nearly impossible for a Zero pilot to track, and several Marine aces credited solar positioning with multiple kills. In 1945, as the war in Europe ended, captured German training documents revealed that the Luftwaffe had developed counter-tactics specifically to address American solar positioning. German pilots were taught to avoid engagements when American fighters had clear solar position, to attack from below rather than from altitude when the sun was high, to use clouds as cover to break up the geometry that made solar positioning effective. But these counter-tactics had limitations. Attacking from below surrendered energy advantage. Avoiding engagement when Americans had solar position meant ceding tactical initiative. Using clouds reduced visibility for everyone. The Germans had recognized solar positioning as a legitimate threat, but hadn't found a reliable way to counter it without sacrificing other tactical advantages. Bob remained in the Air Force after the war, eventually rising to the rank of colonel. He continued to advocate for solar positioning, continued to refine the technique, continued to teach it to new generations of fighter pilots. In Korea, F-86 Sabre pilots used solar positioning against MiG-15s, achieving kills using the same principles Bob had developed in a P-47 over Europe. In the 1960s, when the Air Force was developing the F-4 Phantom, Bob was consulted about cockpit design. He emphasized the importance of canopy clarity, of minimizing reflections and glare that could interfere with a pilot's ability to maintain visual contact while using solar positioning. Some of his recommendations were incorporated into the F-4C variant, improving visibility and making solar tactics easier to execute. The advent of air-to-air missiles in the 1960s and 70s reduced the emphasis on visual combat. Radar-guided missiles could track targets regardless of sun position, could engage enemies beyond visual range. Solar positioning seemed less relevant in an era of technology-dominated air combat, but Vietnam proved that visual combat wasn't obsolete. American pilots found themselves in close-range dogfights where missiles were unreliable and guns were essential. Solar positioning became relevant again. Navy pilots at Top Gun incorporated Bob's techniques into their curriculum, teaching students to use the sun as tactical cover during visual engagements. In 1972, Bob was invited to speak at the first Red Flag exercise at Nellis Air Force Base, a large-scale training event designed to give pilots realistic combat experience. He was 51 years old, long retired from active flying, but his tactical innovations were still being taught to pilots flying aircraft he couldn't have imagined during World War II. "Gentlemen," Bob told the assembled pilots, "technology changes, aircraft change, weapons change, but the sun remains constant. It's the same sun that illuminated dogfights in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. And it creates the same visual challenges for human pilots that it always has. Your enemy, no matter how advanced his aircraft or weapons, still sees with human eyes. Those eyes are vulnerable to glare. That vulnerability is exploitable. Learn to position yourself with the sun behind you, and you'll have an advantage that no amount of enemy technology can fully counter." The F-15 and F-16 pilots listened politely, but many were skeptical. They flew aircraft with sophisticated radar, helmet-mounted sights, advanced missiles. Solar positioning seemed like a relic from an earlier era, a technique that might have been relevant when combat was purely visual, but had limited application in the modern age. Then, red flag exercises demonstrated otherwise. During simulated combat, pilots who used solar positioning, who maneuvered to keep the sun behind them during visual engagements, achieved higher kill ratios than pilots who ignored sun position. The advantage wasn't as dramatic as in World War II, when all combat was visual, but it was measurable. Even pilots with advanced sensors and weapons benefited from being harder to see visually. Modern fighter pilots now receive training in solar tactical positioning as part of basic fighter maneuvers. The terminology has changed. They call it solar masking or sun angle advantage, but the principle remains Bob Johnson's. Position yourself with the sun behind you relative to the threat. Maintain that position through maneuvering. Force the enemy to look into glare when trying to track you. Flight manuals for the F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II include sections on solar positioning, describing how to use the sun as supplementary cover, even when you have stealths, characteristics that make you difficult to detect electronically. The reasoning? Electronic stealth can be countered by new radar technology, but the sun's effect on human vision is a constant that cannot be technologically negated. In 2010, the Air Force Weapons School published a comprehensive study titled Historical Tactical Innovations in Air Combat. An entire chapter was dedicated to Bob Johnson's solar positioning technique, analyzing its development, its effectiveness in World War II, its evolution through subsequent conflicts, and its continuing relevance in modern air combat. The study concluded, Captain Johnson's innovation demonstrates that fundamental physics, in this case, the interaction between sunlight and human vision, can be weaponized into tactical advantage. His technique required no technology, no special equipment, no modifications to existing aircraft. It required only awareness, understanding, and skill. This makes solar positioning one of the most elegant, tactical innovations in air combat history, effective across all eras, applicable to all aircraft types, limited only by the pilot's ability to execute it. Bob Johnson died in 1998 at the age of 77. His funeral was attended by pilots from multiple generations, World War II veterans who'd flown with him, Vietnam-era pilots who'd learned from his techniques, modern fighter pilots who still use solar positioning in combat. They didn't speak of him as a legendary ace, though his 27 kills certainly qualified him for that status. They spoke of him as the pilot who'd understood that the biggest fighter in the sky could be made invisible through nothing but intelligent positioning. At the Air Force Academy, cadets study Bob's August 9, 1943 engagement as an example of exploiting environmental constants for tactical advantage. The lesson isn't specifically about solar positioning, that's a subset of a larger principle. The lesson is about recognizing that every environment contains constants that can be weaponized, that tactical innovation often comes from understanding physics better than your enemy, that the most effective weapons are sometimes the ones that have always been there, waiting to be properly used. One instructor tells cadets, Bob Johnson flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the biggest, most visible fighter in American service. Conventional wisdom said it was impossible to hide. Johnson proved conventional wisdom wrong by understanding that visibility is relative. You're only visible if someone can see you clearly. Position yourself with a bright light source behind you, and you become difficult to see regardless of your size. Johnson turned the P-47's greatest weakness, its massive visible profile, into irrelevance by making visibility itself the variable he controlled. Modern air combat doctrine includes solar positioning as one of several environmental exploitation techniques, methods for using natural phenomena as tactical assets. Other techniques include cloud masking, terrain masking, and sea surface glare exploitation. But solar positioning remains the most universally applicable because the sun is always available, always creates glare, always affects human vision in predictable ways. In 2015, an F-22 pilot shot down a simulated enemy aircraft during a red flag exercise using pure solar positioning. No radar, no missiles, guns-only engagement where he maintained sun position throughout the fight. After landing, he was asked how he'd learned the technique. He said, "It's in the manual, solar tactical positioning developed by Captain Robert Johnson in 1943. I figured if it worked in a P-47 against FW-190s, it would work in an F-22 against simulated threats. Physics doesn't change." The massive P-47 they'd called the barn door became invisible through intelligent positioning. The visibility disadvantage they'd said was insurmountable was overcome through understanding how human vision processes brightness. The technique they'd dismissed as too complex became standard doctrine taught to every fighter pilot. Bob Johnson's legacy isn't just the 27 kills he scored, though those kills proved his technique's effectiveness. His legacy is the understanding that tactical advantage comes from understanding your environment better than your enemy, that physics is a weapon if you know how to use it, that the most effective innovations often exploit natural phenomena rather than technological advantages. Every time a fighter pilot checks sun position before engaging, every time someone maneuvers to put the sun behind them during combat, every time tactical advantage comes from controlling an environmental variable rather than from superior equipment, that's Bob Johnson's legacy. They said the P-47 was too big to hide. They said visibility was the Thunderbolt's fatal flaw. They said you couldn't make a 7-ton fighter disappear. Bob Johnson proved them wrong by understanding that the sun, the constant, unavoidable light source present in every daylight engagement, could be used to make even the biggest aircraft nearly invisible. Lost visual! Lost visual! The German radio intercepts tell the story. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, skilled and aggressive, losing track of massive American fighters because those fighters were positioned with the sun behind them. Pilots squinting into glare, unable to track targets, making defensive decisions because they couldn't see clearly enough to attack confidently. Bob Johnson's P-47 didn't hide behind the sun. It used the sun as cover, exploited the physics of brightness and contrast, weaponized the natural limitations of human vision, and in doing so, proved that the biggest fighter in the sky could vanish behind nothing but light. The barn door became a ghost, the most visible aircraft became tactically invisible, and Bob Johnson, the quiet kid from Oklahoma who understood physics better than most engineers, revolutionized air combat by teaching pilots to fight from the one position where size didn't matter. the position where you're backlit by a star.